The convoy of military trucks had been travelling for what felt like endless days, though in truth it had been just over 3 weeks since the women had been rounded up and loaded onto the canvas-covered vehicles. The engine noise had become a constant companion, a low mechanical growl that vibrated through the wooden benches where they sat, backs pressed against the metal framework, trying to find some position that didn't leave their muscles screaming after hours of being jostled over rutted roads. Now, however, that familiar rumble was diminishing, the vehicles decelerating with a groan of brakes and gears, and every woman in that truck felt her stomach tighten with a dread so intense it was almost physical pain. They had known this moment was coming. From the instant they'd been herded onto these trucks, surrounded by guards whose expressions offered no comfort, they had understood that eventually the journey would end. Eventually they would arrive at whatever destination awaited them. The problem was that none of them knew with any certainty what that destination would hold, only that every rumour, every whispered warning, every carefully delivered piece of propaganda they had absorbed over the years suggested it would be terrible beyond imagination. The Americans, they had been told repeatedly, were not civilized soldiers. They were something worse, something brutal and unpredictable, and women captured by such forces could expect treatment that was better left unspoken. The iron gates appeared first as shadows through the gaps in the canvas covering, dark vertical lines that grew more distinct as the trucks rolled closer. Then came the screech of metal on metal as those gates swung open, a sound that made several of the women flinch despite themselves. Through the canvas they could see barbed wire now, coil upon coil of it, stretching away in both directions, creating boundaries that looked impossible to breach. The wire caught the afternoon sunlight and seemed to shimmer with menace, each barb a tiny promise of pain for anyone foolish enough to test it. There were dozens of them crammed into the back of each truck, secretaries who had typed letters and filed documents, nurses who had tended to wounded soldiers in field hospitals, auxiliaries who had performed 100 different support roles for the military machine. All of them were women who had never imagined they would end up here, sitting on hard wooden benches that had left bruises on their thighs, wearing uniforms that had once been crisp and proper, but were now torn, stained, and hanging loosely on frames that had grown thinner during weeks of reduced rations and constant movement. Their eyes, uniformly wide with apprehension, fixed on the barbed wire perimeter, as if trying to memorize every detail of their prison before they were forced to enter it. Behind the trucks, dust rose in thick clouds, stirred up by the tires and hanging in the still air before settling slowly onto everything and everyone. It coated the canvas, the metal framework, the women's uniforms, their hair, their skin. Some of them were so covered in the pale dust that they looked almost ghostly, like figures carved from stone rather than living, breathing people. But they were very much alive, and very much aware of every sensation, every sound, every detail of what was happening as the convoy came to its final stop. The engines cut out one by one, and in the sudden relative silence, a new sound emerged that sent waves of fear through every woman in every truck. It was the sound of boots, heavy military boots hitting packed earth with the distinctive rhythm of soldiers on the move. These were not the boots of their own countrymen, not the familiar sounds they had grown accustomed to over years of war. These were different, heavier somehow, more deliberate, carrying with them the weight of victory and the authority of captors over captured. Through the gaps in the canvas, they could see the American guards now, and the sight of them made several women gasp despite their efforts to remain silent and inconspicuous. The guards were enormous, or at least they seemed that way from the perspective of women who had been travelling for weeks with little food and less sleep, women whose own forces had been steadily depleted and whose nation had been losing ground for months. These American soldiers stood tall against the afternoon sky, their broad shoulders seemingly as wide as the trucks themselves, their uniforms clean and well-maintained, their rifles gleaming with the kind of care that suggested they were not mere props but functional weapons that could be deployed at a moment's notice. Every movement the guards made seemed choreographed for maximum intimidation. The way they walked, unhurried but purposeful, suggested men who were completely in control of the situation and knew it. The way they held their rifles, not quite aimed but not quite at rest either, conveyed both capability and potential threat. The afternoon light caught on the metal of those weapons and sent reflections dancing across the canvas walls of the trucks, little flashes of brightness that drew the eye and reminded everyone present exactly who held the power here. The women had been warned about this. Oh, how they had been warned. Their officers, in those final chaotic days before capture became inevitable, had gathered them together and spoken in tones that brooked no argument. "The Americans are not like us," they had said. "The Americans do not follow the same rules, do not hold to the same standards. If you are captured, and it was always if, never when, as though there might still be some possibility of escape, you will face treatment that no civilized person should have to endure. You will face humiliation, you will face degradation. You will face things that are worse than death itself, and death might seem preferable before the end." Those words, delivered with such certainty and such grim emphasis, had lodged themselves deep in every woman's mind. They echoed now, louder than the crunch of gravel beneath the boots of the American guards outside, louder than the creak of the truck's suspension as it settled after the long journey, louder even than the hammering of hearts that seemed to fill the canvas-covered space with their collective rhythm. The Americans are brutes, the Americans are savages, the Americans will destroy you in ways that cannot be spoken aloud. Among the women pressed together in the truck was one who looked impossibly young, barely 19 if that, her face still carrying traces of the childhood she had left behind only recently. Her hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, bloodless, the bones standing out sharply against skin that had been bronzed by sun during the journey, but now looked pale despite the tan. Her lips were moving, forming words that produced no sound, and anyone watching closely would have recognized the rhythm of prayer, the desperate seeking of divine intervention or comfort, or simply something to focus on other than the terror that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Beside her sat another woman, older by perhaps a decade, who had made a different choice in how to cope with this moment. She had fixed her gaze on the wooden floor of the truck, on the dirt and dust that had accumulated there during the journey, and she refused to lift her eyes no matter what happened outside. She would not look at the guards. She would not acknowledge their presence. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing fear in her face, even though fear was coursing through her veins like ice water, making her feel simultaneously frozen and desperate to flee. The back of the truck opened with a metallic clang that made everyone jump. The canvas was pulled aside roughly, flooding the interior with bright afternoon sunlight that was painful after the dimness they had grown accustomed to. Silhouetted against that brightness were the shapes of American guards, and their voices came next, speaking in English with tones that were brisk and commanding and completely incomprehensible to women who spoke only German. The words themselves were meaningless sounds, a rapid stream of syllables that conveyed nothing specific, but the tone carried meaning that transcended language barriers. These were orders. These were commands that expected immediate compliance. The guards might as well have been speaking in clear German for all the clarity that tone provided. Get out, line up, move, now. One by one, the women climbed down from the truck, their movements stiff and awkward after so many hours of sitting, their legs uncertain beneath them as they made contact with solid ground for the first time in what felt like forever. Each woman who emerged from the canvas-covered darkness into the bright afternoon light felt her heart pounding so hard it seemed likely to burst from her chest. Each one felt the weight of eyes upon her, measuring, judging, categorizing. Each one wondered if this was the moment when everything they had been warned about would begin to happen. The sunlight was merciless after the shadowed interior of the truck, striking them with an intensity that made several women raise their hands instinctively to shield their eyes. As their vision adjusted, the full scope of their new reality became visible, and it was every bit as intimidating as they had feared. Watchtowers rose at regular intervals around the perimeter, tall wooden structures with platforms at the top where more guards stood, and visible even at this distance were the rifles those guards carried, always present, always ready. The towers seemed to lean inward, looming over the compound like stern sentinels whose job was to ensure that no one who entered would ever leave without permission. The women were directed to form lines, and they shuffled into position with the awkward uncertainty of people who are not sure exactly what is expected of them but are desperately trying to comply before punishment can be delivered for failure. Their eyes darted constantly, trying to take in everything at once, trying to spot the danger before it could materialize, trying to find some clue about what would happen next. The nearest section of fence was close enough that they could see individual barbs on the wire, each one gleaming in the sunlight, each one looking sharp enough to tear flesh with the slightest contact. The wire was arranged in spiral coils that reminded one woman of the spring inside a mechanical clock, wound tight and ready to snap at any provocation. Rumours had filled the journey, whispered from woman to woman during those brief moments when the trucks stopped and they could huddle together in the darkness. Rumours about what happened to prisoners in American custody, each tale darker than the last. They would be starved, some said, given just enough food to keep them alive, but never enough to satisfy the gnawing hunger. They would be beaten for the smallest infractions, perhaps beaten for no reason at all, just for the entertainment of bored guards. They would be mocked, paraded before jeering crowds, stripped of every shred of dignity they still possessed. And women especially, faced risks that no one wanted to articulate clearly, but everyone understood implicitly. There were fates worse than death, and women captured by a victorious army could expect to encounter those fates with grim regularity. Each step the women took as they were marched into formation felt like movement deeper into a nightmare made real. This was not the abstract fear of capture they had lived with during the final days before surrender. This was concrete, immediate, unavoidable. This was happening right now, and there was nothing they could do to stop it or escape it. They were completely at the mercy of these American soldiers who surrounded them, and mercy was not something they had been led to expect. The American soldiers themselves seemed almost impossibly tall from the perspective of women who were tired, frightened, and suffering from weeks of inadequate nutrition. The guards moved with a confidence that suggested they had done this many times before, that processing prisoners was routine for them, just another day's work that required attention but not any particular emotional investment. Some of them carried clipboards, making notes and checking lists, while others kept their hands on their rifles, not quite aiming but not quite at ease either, maintaining a state of readiness that suggested they could respond instantly to any threat or disturbance. The women studied those faces, trying to read something in the expressions of their captors, some hint of what was to come. But the American faces were stern and largely unreadable, giving away nothing. There was no obvious cruelty there, no sadistic pleasure in having prisoners at their mercy, but there was no compassion either, no softening that suggested these guards saw the women as human beings deserving of sympathy. They were simply doing their jobs, following procedures, maintaining order. Still, for women who had been conditioned to expect the worst, even neutral expressions seemed threatening. When one guard reached up to adjust his helmet, shifting it slightly to sit more comfortably on his head, a nurse standing nearby flinched violently, her whole body tensing in anticipation of a blow that never came. The guard had simply been adjusting his helmet, nothing more, but to her it had looked like the beginning of violence, and her body had reacted before her mind could process what was actually happening. When another guard pointed toward one of the wooden barracks buildings that stood in neat rows throughout the compound, indicating with a gesture where the women should go, several of them braced themselves for what would come next. Surely this was when the violence would begin. Surely this gesture was the prelude to something terrible. But instead, they were simply marched forward, boots and shoes scuffing against the packed earth, moving in a loose formation toward the building the guard had indicated. No one shoved them. No one shouted insults or threats. There were only the steady rhythm of boots hitting ground and the sharp, clipped sound of orders being barked in English, orders that were unintelligible as words but perfectly clear in their basic meaning. Go there, move forward, keep walking. The silence, in its own way, was perhaps more frightening than overt cruelty would have been. Cruelty they had been prepared for. They had steeled themselves to endure it. But this calculated, procedural silence offered no information, no clues about what to expect. It was the silence of bureaucracy, of systems functioning according to rules that the prisoners did not understand and had no way to influence. It was silence that said, "Your feelings do not matter here. Your fear does not matter. Only the procedures matter. Only the proper processing of prisoners according to regulations matters." Smoke was rising from the chimneys of some of the barracks, thin trails of grey that dispersed into the afternoon air. The smell of food drifted across the compound, faint but unmistakable, and despite themselves, several women noticed it, their stomachs clenching with hunger they had been trying to ignore. But they did not dare acknowledge that smell, did not dare hope that food might actually be offered, because hope was dangerous. Hope meant letting your guard down, and letting your guard down meant being vulnerable to whatever cruelty was being prepared. Instead, they focused on the rifles. Always the rifles. The weapons were everywhere, held by guards at regular intervals around the compound, visible in the hands of soldiers manning the watchtowers, gleaming in the afternoon light as though they had been polished specifically to catch the eye and serve as constant reminders of who held the power. Those rifles were the one constant, the one thing that made sense in a situation that otherwise seemed to defy everything the women had been told to expect. They might not understand why they had not been beaten yet, but they understood the rifles. Those, at least, spoke a language that transcended words. The first night in captivity was approaching as they were finally directed into one of the barracks buildings. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful under other circumstances, but now seemed almost mocking, as though nature itself was indifferent to their suffering. The barracks door was opened, and the women filed inside, passing from the relatively open space of the compound into the confined interior of the building, and when that door shut behind them with a heavy, final-sounding thud, several women felt their last hope of escape evaporate completely. This was real. This was happening. And as darkness began to fall over the camp, as the first night of captivity settled over them like a suffocating blanket, the women stood uncertainly in their new prison, carrying not just their few belongings, but the crushing, overwhelming weight of fear that had been building since the moment they first understood that capture was inevitable. They had survived the journey, but survival now felt less like relief and more like simply postponing whatever terrible fate awaited them in this place, under the control of an enemy they had been taught to fear above all else. The interior of the barracks gradually revealed itself as the women's eyes adjusted from the brightness outside to the dimmer light within. Long rows of wooden bunks stretched from one end of the building to the other, double-stacked beds with thin mattresses and rough blankets that looked as though they had seen considerable use before the current occupants arrived. The smell that filled the air was distinctive, a combination of raw wood and damp cloth, with undertones of the many bodies that had occupied this space before them. It was not pleasant, but neither was it as terrible as some had feared. It was simply institutional, the smell of a place designed to house large numbers of people with maximum efficiency and minimum comfort. For several long minutes after the door closed, no one spoke. The silence stretched out, becoming oppressive in its weight, broken only by the muted sounds of American guards talking outside, their voices filtering through the wooden walls but remaining incomprehensible, just sounds without meaning that served as a constant reminder of who controlled this place. The women exchanged glances, each trying to gauge the reactions of the others, looking for some sign of how they should respond to this situation. Every woman in that barracks was remembering the same things. The warnings had been so clear, so emphatic, so repeatedly delivered that they were impossible to forget now. German officers, in those final desperate weeks before the end came, had spoken to them again and again about what to expect from the Americans. The enemy was savage, they had been told. The enemy was brutal beyond measure. The enemy would treat captured women as spoils of war, as objects to be used and discarded, as things rather than people. Sometimes those warnings had been delivered with clinical directness, officers standing before assembled groups and spelling out in explicit terms what captured women might face. The descriptions had been horrifying, deliberately so, designed to ensure that every woman understood exactly what was at stake. Better to die fighting than to be taken alive, some officers had suggested, though of course when the moment came, when capture became inevitable, most had chosen survival over death, choosing to cling to life even if life meant enduring whatever the Americans might inflict upon them. Other times the warnings had been more subtle, conveyed through looks rather than words, through silences that spoke volumes, through the way certain topics were raised and then quickly dropped as though they were too terrible to discuss openly. The officers would narrow their eyes when speaking of the Americans, their expressions darkening with implications that needed no verbal articulation. They would tell stories, supposedly true accounts from other fronts, other battles, other women who had been captured and who had suffered in ways that validated every fear. Around campfires in the evening, during those last days before capture, the warnings had been passed from soldier to soldier, from woman to woman, each retelling adding new details, new horrors, new reasons to be afraid. The stories grew in the telling, as stories always do, becoming more elaborate and more terrifying with each iteration. By the time capture actually came, every woman had absorbed so many warnings, heard so many stories, internalized so many fears that the Americans had become monsters in their minds, creatures that wore human faces but possessed none of human compassion or restraint. Now, sitting in this barracks, some of the women lowered themselves stiffly onto the bunks, their movements cautious as though they expected the furniture itself might be a trap. They clutched their bags close, the few possessions they had been allowed to bring with them during the journey, holding these meagre belongings as though they were shields that might offer some protection against whatever was coming. Others remained standing, too tense to rest, their muscles locked tight with adrenaline and fear, their minds racing through possibilities of what might happen next. One woman, her voice barely above a whisper, murmured to those nearest to her that they would not survive the night. She said it with such conviction that several others nodded in agreement, as though she had simply articulated what they were all thinking. The Americans would come after dark, she suggested. That was when it would happen. That was when the real horrors would begin. During the day there might be some pretense of following rules, but night would strip away those pretenses and reveal the truth. Another woman spoke up, her voice shaking slightly as she shared a different fear. The food, she said, when food was brought to them, if food was brought to them, would be poisoned. Not enough to kill quickly, perhaps, but enough to make them sick, to weaken them, to make them compliant and unable to resist. The Americans would want them helpless, after all. They would want to break them down before the real cruelty began. Poison would be efficient, subtle, a way to accomplish that goal while maintaining a veneer of civilization. A third woman insisted that they would be paraded for mockery at dawn. She had heard stories, she said, about how the Americans liked to humiliate their prisoners, to march them past cheering crowds of soldiers who would jeer and spit and make clear exactly how little respect they had for those they had defeated. The humiliation would be psychological preparation for what came after, she explained, a way of breaking their spirits before breaking their bodies. Every creak of boots outside the barracks made the women freeze. Every shadow that passed across the small windows sent a ripple of tension through the group. They waited, listening, watching, expecting at any moment that the door would burst open and the nightmares they had been promised would become reality. Their hearts hammered in their chests. Their breathing remained shallow and quick. Their hands clenched into fists or gripped the edges of bunks or twisted in fabric, needing something physical to hold on to while their minds struggled with fear. But minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, even though the light outside suggested it had not been that long. The guards outside continued talking in those low, calm voices that sounded almost casual, as though everything was perfectly normal, as though there were no terrified women inside the barracks, as though this were just another routine day requiring routine attention. The tone of those voices was unsettling in its ordinariness. How could they sound so relaxed? How could they conduct conversations in such normal tones when surely they must be planning terrible things? When finally something did happen, it was not what any of the women had expected. The door opened, not violently but simply firmly, and a guard entered carrying a large tray. On that tray were arranged portions of food, thick slices of bread that looked fresh-baked, bowls of soup that steamed in the cooling evening air, and metal cups filled with some dark liquid that gave off a bitter smell which some of the women would later identify as coffee, though coffee of a sort they had never encountered before. The guard set the tray down on a wooden table near the door, said something in English that might have been instructions or might have been simply informing them that food had arrived, and then departed, pulling the door closed behind him. The whole interaction took perhaps 30 seconds, and throughout it the guard had not raised his voice, had not made any threatening gestures, had simply performed what was clearly a routine task, and then moved on to whatever other duties awaited him. The women stared at the food as though it were a serpent coiled and ready to strike. No one moved toward it. No one reached out to take a portion. The bread sat there, still warm enough that steam rose faintly from the crust. The soup continued giving off tendrils of steam that dispersed into the increasingly cool air of the barracks. The coffee remained untouched in its cups. It was more food than many of them had seen in one place for weeks, possibly months, and yet no one dared to touch it. Suspicion moved through the group like an electric current, visible in their tense postures and the way their eyes kept darting from the food to each other and back again. This had to be a trap. It was too much, too generous, too unexpected. Why would the Americans feed them well? Why would they provide what appeared to be genuine nourishment rather than the starvation rations the women had been led to expect? The woman who had earlier warned about poison spoke up again, her voice firm with certainty. She pointed out that the soup could be laced with anything, substances that would make them sick or compliant or worse. The Americans were clever after all. Everyone knew that. They would not simply beat their prisoners into submission when there were more subtle methods available. Poison in food was exactly the sort of thing a sophisticated enemy would employ. Another woman nodded and shared her own plan. She had bread hidden beneath her skirt, she admitted, bread she had somehow managed to save from an earlier meal during the journey. She would not eat the American food. She would not take the risk. Better to subsist on what she knew to be safe, even if it meant going hungry, than to ingest something that might be their first step toward total subjugation. Others listened to these warnings and found themselves unwilling to take the risk despite the gnawing hunger that had become their constant companion. Hunger was familiar now. They had learned to live with it, to push it aside, to ignore the way their stomachs cramped and their energy flagged. They could endure more hunger. What they could not endure was the unknown, the possibility that this food carried threats they could not see or taste until it was too late. And so the food sat there, untouched, slowly cooling as the evening progressed toward night. The steam that had risen from soup and bread gradually dissipated. The coffee, which had been hot enough to be uncomfortable to drink, cooled to a temperature where it would have been pleasant. But still, no one reached for it. The tray became a symbol of their uncertainty, sitting there in the middle of the barracks like an accusation or a test they were not prepared to take. To the Americans outside, had they known or cared, this was simply routine. Meals were provided according to regulations that governed the treatment of prisoners. There were rules about such things, standards that were supposed to be maintained, quotas of calories and nutritional requirements that were meant to be met. The guards were following orders, nothing more, performing their duties according to the procedures that had been established long before these particular prisoners arrived. But to the women inside the barracks, nothing about this situation felt routine. Every decision, no matter how small, carried enormous weight. Every choice might be the difference between survival and destruction. The food was not just food. It was a question, a challenge, a test of their judgment and their ability to navigate this strange new world where nothing made sense and everything contradicted what they had been so carefully taught to expect. They sat in the gathering darkness, wrapped in thin blankets that provided little warmth, watching the shadows lengthen and merge as night fell completely over the camp. The food remained where it had been left, now completely cold, no longer appetizing even if they had been willing to risk eating it. And the women huddled together, drawing what comfort they could from proximity to others who shared their fear, waiting for morning and whatever it might bring, wondering if they would survive to see another dawn, and if survival was even something to be hoped for, given what they still believed awaited them in this place. Outside, the sounds of the camp continued. Guards changed shifts with brief exchanges that filtered through the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and carried on the night air came the faint sound of music, someone playing a harmonica with the kind of casual skill that suggested long practice. The tune was slow, almost melancholy, and it drifted across the compound like something from another world, from a place where war did not exist and men were not divided into captors and captured. That music unsettled the prisoners in ways they could not quite articulate. It seemed wrong somehow that guards would play music, that they would engage in something so ordinary and human while holding women prisoner. Music suggested leisure, normalcy, perhaps even contentment. It made the Americans seem less like the monsters the women had been prepared for, and more like ordinary men passing time during a boring shift. That should have been comforting, but instead it was deeply confusing, because if the Americans were just ordinary men, then everything the women had been told was wrong, and that possibility was almost more frightening than the prospect of facing monsters. Sleep, when it came at all, came in brief, fitful bursts. Some women wept quietly, pressing their faces into thin pillows to muffle the sounds, ashamed to show such weakness, but unable to contain the emotion that had been building for weeks. Others lay rigid in their bunks, eyes open, staring at the dark ceiling or the even darker shapes of the bunks above them, their minds racing through scenarios of what tomorrow might bring, each possibility more terrible than the last. The youngest prisoner in the barracks, a girl who could not have been more than 18 years old and possibly was younger, whispered prayers in the darkness. Her voice was so quiet that only those in nearby bunks could hear her. But the rhythm was unmistakable, the cadence of someone seeking divine intervention or at least divine comfort in a situation that seemed to offer no earthly source of either. She prayed for protection, for strength, for deliverance. She prayed for her family, wondering if they knew where she was or if they assumed she had died during the chaos of the final days before surrender. She prayed for morning to never come, and simultaneously for morning to arrive quickly so that the uncertainty of waiting would end. No one stopped her from praying. In fact, several women near her began their own quiet prayers, each woman speaking to whatever deity she believed in, using whatever words brought her comfort. For the first time in weeks, prayer felt necessary in a way it had not before. During the journey, during the confusion and chaos of defeat and capture, there had been too much happening too quickly to pause for spiritual reflection. But now, in the dark, in the quiet punctuated only by the occasional sound from outside, prayer became a lifeline, something to hold on to when everything else seemed to be slipping away. The hours crawled by with the kind of slowness that makes time feel like torture in itself. The guards outside continued their patrols, their footsteps regular and predictable, creating a rhythm that some of the women found themselves counting unconsciously. Steps approaching, steps passing, steps receding into distance. Then silence for a measured period before the next patrol passed. It was orderly, systematic, and somehow that very orderliness made it more unnerving rather than less. The feared intrusion, the violence everyone expected, did not materialize. The door remained closed. The guards remained outside. Nothing changed except the slow rotation of the night sky beyond the windows and the gradual shift from pitch darkness to the slightly lesser darkness that comes before dawn. The women who had managed to sleep woke frequently, startled by sounds real or imagined, their hearts racing as they tried to orient themselves and remember where they were. When morning light finally began to seep through the cracks around the door and through the small windows set high in the barracks walls, many of the women were surprised to find themselves still alive, still unharmed, still unmolested. The night had passed without incident. No Americans had burst in to assault them, no violence had been delivered, no humiliation had been forced upon them. They had simply been left alone in the barracks, allowed to spend the night in relative peace, disturbed by nothing worse than their own fears and imaginings. That realization brought no relief. Instead, it brought a new kind of confusion, because if the Americans had not harmed them during the night, when they would have been most vulnerable and least able to resist, then when would it happen? And if it was not going to happen, if the threats they had been warned about were not going to materialize, then what did that mean? The questions multiplied faster than answers could be formulated. In that early morning light, with fatigue weighing on every woman and fear still coiling in every heart, something began to shift. It was not trust, not even close to trust. It was not comfort or acceptance or anything positive. It was simply the first tiny seed of doubt in everything they had been so carefully, so repeatedly, so emphatically taught about their enemy. Had everything they'd been told been lies? The question was too big, too dangerous, too revolutionary to voice aloud. But in the privacy of their own thoughts, more than one woman was beginning to wonder, and wondering was the first step towards something that would prove far more transformative than any of them could imagine in that moment. Dawn arrived slowly, the way it always does, indifferent to human drama or fear, simply following the eternal pattern of darkness giving way to light. The pale illumination crept across the compound gradually, painting everything in shades of grey before colour began to return to the world. Through the small windows of the barracks, the women could see morning mist clinging to the ground, wrapping around the bases of the watchtowers and the fence posts, making everything look softer and less threatening than it had in the harsh afternoon light of their arrival. But that gentleness was an illusion, and every woman in the barracks knew it. The sound they had been unconsciously dreading arrived right on schedule, announced by the familiar crunch of boots on gravel. The rhythm was steady and deliberate, each step placed with military precision, and it grew louder as whoever was walking approached the barracks. Multiple sets of boots, actually, suggesting a group of guards rather than a single individual. That realization made several women sit up straighter in their bunks, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten as adrenaline surged through their systems once again. When the door was pulled open, the sudden flood of morning light made several prisoners flinch, their hands rising instinctively to shield eyes that had grown accustomed to the dim interior. Silhouetted in that doorway were 2 American guards, their rifles slung across their shoulders in a way that suggested they were carried out of regulation rather than immediate necessity. The guards' faces, backlit as they were, remained unreadable, just dark shapes against the brightness behind them. The guards began speaking immediately, their voices carrying the same brisk, business-like quality they had displayed the previous day. The words were rapid English, completely incomprehensible to women who had never had reason to learn the language, but the gestures that accompanied those words were clear enough. The guards were indicating, through a combination of pointing and beckoning motions, that the women should line up. Time to get up. Time to assemble. Time to move. For several long seconds, no one moved. The women sat frozen in their bunks, paralysed by a combination of fear and the physical reluctance to leave what had become, over the course of the night, a familiar space that felt marginally safer than whatever awaited outside. Better to stay here, the thinking went. Better to remain in this known quantity than to venture into the unknown where anything might happen. The silence stretched, becoming awkward and tense. One of the guards, his patience clearly wearing thin, raised his hand. Several women gasped, certain that the blow they had been expecting for hours was finally about to be delivered. But the hand did not descend in violence. Instead, it simply gestured again, more emphatically this time, toward the doorway, and the guard's expression, now visible as he stepped slightly to the side and the light shifted, showed irritation rather than cruelty. He was annoyed, certainly, at prisoners who were not following simple instructions, but there was no indication that he intended to hurt anyone for their slowness in complying. Slowly, reluctantly, like a machine that needed oil before it could function smoothly, the women began to move. They climbed down from their bunks with movements made stiff by a night spent tensed against fear and a journey that had left them with muscles that ached constantly. They formed a line with the awkward uncertainty of people who are trying their best to comply with orders they do not fully understand, standing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes fixed mainly on the floor or on the backs of the women in front of them, determined not to make eye contact with the guards unless absolutely necessary. Each step toward the door felt heavy, laden with dread about what awaited them outside. Their movements were mechanical, driven by the need to obey rather than by any willingness to embrace whatever was coming. The rifles remained ever present in their awareness, those weapons slung across the guards' shoulders, serving as constant reminders that resistance was not merely futile, but potentially deadly. Whatever these Americans wanted, the women would have to give, because refusal was not an option available to prisoners. The morning air outside the barracks was sharp and cold, carrying with it the kind of chill that speaks of seasons changing, of winter approaching, of the world continuing its cycles regardless of war or capture or human suffering. A thin mist still hung low over the ground, giving everything a dreamlike quality that would have been beautiful if the circumstances had been different. The watchtowers rose through that mist like islands emerging from a sea of white, and at the top of each tower the familiar shapes of guards were visible, their rifles dark lines against the gradually brightening sky. The women were marched toward a central area of the camp, a space that appeared to serve as a gathering point, a square of packed earth where other prisoners were already assembled. These other prisoners, women like themselves who had been captured at various points and brought to this place, stood in neat rows, their postures speaking of exhaustion and fear similar to what the new arrivals felt. None of the assembled prisoners spoke. The silence was thick enough to feel like a physical presence, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the occasional cough or cleared throat. Some of the women from the newly arrived transport clutched their blankets close, having grabbed them as they left the barracks, wrapping the thin fabric around their shoulders like armor against both cold and the gazes of the Americans who surrounded the assembly area. Others kept their heads bowed, chins nearly touching their chests, refusing to look up, refusing to meet the eyes of anyone, whether fellow prisoners or guards. It was a defensive posture born of years of being taught that women should be modest, should be unassuming, should not draw attention to themselves, and in this context that training manifested as an attempt to simply disappear, to become so small and insignificant that perhaps cruelty would pass them by. Every gesture any guard made seemed dangerous when viewed through the lens of terror. When a guard shifted his weight from one foot to another, several women tensed, preparing for action. When another guard reached into his pocket to retrieve what turned out to be a small notebook, the women nearest to him actually took half a step backward, convinced he was reaching for a weapon or for something else that promised violence. The world had become a place where every movement carried potential threat, where innocuous actions were reinterpreted as preludes to harm. Roll call began with an American sergeant standing at the front of the assembly, clipboard in hand, reading from a list of names. The pronunciation was atrocious, German names mangled by an English speaker who was clearly doing his best but lacked any familiarity with the phonetic patterns of the language. Names that should have been crisp and clear became muddy and confused. Family names that carried history and pride were rendered almost unrecognizable. Each time the sergeant called a name, he would look up expectantly, waiting for someone to respond. The women had to strain to recognize their own names in the butchered pronunciations, trying to match the sounds being produced with the names they had carried all their lives. When a woman finally realized her name had been called, she would raise her hand tentatively, her voice often coming out as barely more than a whisper as she acknowledged the call. To the Americans, this was simply necessary administrative procedure. Prisoners had to be counted and tracked. Records had to be maintained. It was bureaucratic necessity, nothing more, the kind of routine paperwork that every military organization generates in vast quantities. The guards performed this duty with the kind of bored efficiency that spoke of having done it many times before and knowing they would do it many times again. But to the women, the experience felt like something very different. Having their names reduced to items on a list, mispronounced and stripped of their proper sound and meaning, felt like a form of humiliation. Their identities were being processed, catalogued, filed away, as though they were objects rather than people. Inventory to be tracked rather than human beings with histories and families and lives that had been interrupted by war. One particularly young prisoner, a girl who looked as though she might have been in school just a few years earlier, trembled so violently when her name was called that she could barely manage to raise her hand. Her whole body shook as though she were standing in sub-zero temperatures rather than simply morning chill. When she tried to speak, to acknowledge that yes, she was present, her voice came out as nothing more than a squeak that was nearly inaudible even to those standing directly beside her. An American guard near her frowned at this response, his forehead creasing with what might have been concern or might have been simple irritation at not being able to hear clearly. He spoke sharply, not loudly, but with the kind of crisp authority that demanded a better response, asking presumably for her to speak up, to confirm her presence more clearly so it could be properly noted on the records. The young woman recoiled from that sharp tone as though she had been physically struck. Her body jerked backward, her eyes went wide with terror, and for a moment it seemed entirely possible she might simply collapse from fear. To her, that tone confirmed everything she had been taught to expect. This was the beginning. This was where cruelty would start to show itself. This sharp word would be followed by sharper actions, and those actions would escalate until everything the warnings had promised came to pass. But the guard simply waited, his expression now showing puzzlement more than anything else. He clearly did not understand why this simple request for confirmation had provoked such an extreme reaction. After a moment, when the girl managed a trembling nod that was at least visible even if she could not make her voice work properly, the guard made a mark on his list and moved on to the next name. No punishment was delivered. No violence occurred. The moment passed, leaving the young woman shaking but unharmed. When the roll call finally concluded, all names checked off, all prisoners accounted for, the guards began organizing the women into smaller groups. Again, the instructions were delivered in incomprehensible English, but gestures and physical guidance made the meaning clear. The prisoners were being divided, separated into different units, though for what purpose no one could immediately determine. That uncertainty spawned immediate fear throughout the assembled women. Whispered conversations broke out despite the presence of guards, women leaning toward each other to share theories and fears about what this division might mean. "This is where they separate us for different treatment," one woman hissed to her neighbour. "They'll take the young ones for one purpose, and the rest for another." The specifics of what those different purposes might be were left unsaid, but the implications hung heavy in the air between them, understood without needing explicit articulation. The first group of prisoners was led away from the assembly area, marching in a loose formation toward one of the buildings that had chimneys from which smoke was actively rising. The smell of cooking food grew stronger as they approached, and several women actually felt their mouths water despite their fear, their bodies responding to the promise of sustenance even while their minds remained locked in terror about what might actually await them. Inside, they found themselves in what was obviously a camp kitchen, a large space dominated by industrial stoves, massive pots and pans, long preparation tables, and all the infrastructure necessary to feed large numbers of people. Steam rose from several pots that were already bubbling on the stoves, and the warmth of the room was immediately noticeable after the chill outside. The smell was overwhelming, yeast from bread that had been or was being baked, vegetables being boiled, meat of some kind being prepared, all of it mixing together into an aroma that spoke of actual proper food rather than the thin soups and hard bread that had been standard for so long. The women assigned to this group braced themselves, waiting for whatever task would be demanded of them, convinced it would be some form of punishment disguised as work. But the American guard who supervised the kitchen area simply pointed to various stations, to the pots that needed stirring, the vegetables that needed cutting, the bread that needed to be checked, and through a combination of gesture and demonstration, made clear that the prisoners were expected to help with food preparation. This assignment spawned its own confusion. Kitchen work was not punishment. Kitchen work was warm, relatively safe, involved being around food, which was something every chronically hungry person desired. Why would the Americans assign prisoners to such a relatively pleasant task? What was the catch? There had to be a catch. Nothing in war was ever simple or kind without there being some hidden cruelty lurking beneath the surface. The second group of prisoners was marched in a different direction, toward a building that turned out to house the camp laundry facilities. Large tubs of water waited, already filled and steaming slightly in the cool air, with bars of rough soap stacked on shelves along one wall. Drying lines were strung across the ceiling, and piles of dirty uniforms and linens were heaped in corners waiting to be processed. Again, the prisoners waited for cruelty to manifest, but the work assignment was simply that, work. They were to wash the camp's laundry, using the provided soap and water, hanging items to dry, ensuring that clothing and linens were clean and ready for use. It was hard physical labour, certainly, the kind of work that would leave muscles sore and hands raw, but it was not torture. It was not humiliation beyond the general degradation of being forced labour. It was simply work that needed doing. The confusion this generated was perhaps more destabilizing than outright cruelty would have been. The women had prepared themselves mentally to endure punishment. They had steeled themselves to survive whatever barbaric treatment the Americans decided to inflict. What they had not prepared for was being treated as simply labor, as workers who had tasks to complete, as people who would be used for their ability to perform mundane necessary functions rather than for their capacity to suffer. The remaining prisoners were handed tools, brooms and rakes and shovels, and directed to begin clearing and maintaining the campgrounds. Leaves had accumulated in corners. Dirt and debris had blown against buildings. The paths between barracks needed to be swept clean. It was routine maintenance of the type that had to be performed in any facility housing large numbers of people. Work that had no dramatic purpose but simply kept the space functional and reasonably tidy. Suspicion did not fade. Every instruction delivered by guards was studied for hidden meanings. Every gesture was analysed for signs of impending cruelty. The women worked, yes, because they had no choice but to work. But they did so while constantly watching the Americans, waiting for the moment when the mask would drop and the real treatment would begin. Surely this normalcy was temporary. Surely the cruelty was simply being delayed rather than being absent entirely. One nurse, a woman in her early 30s, whose hands bore the scars and calluses of years spent in field hospitals, found herself struggling with a particularly heavy bucket filled with water that needed to be moved from one location to another. The bucket was metal, old and dented, and when filled to the brim with water, it weighed far more than she could comfortably manage. She lifted it with both hands, her arms immediately protesting, and began trying to carry it the required distance, water sloshing over the sides and soaking her uniform. An American guard noticed her struggle almost immediately. He had been standing nearby, supervising the work in that section of the camp, and his attention was caught by the obvious difficulty she was having. The nurse saw him notice, saw him begin to move in her direction, and her heart plummeted into her stomach. This was it. This was the moment. She had drawn attention to herself by struggling with a task, and now punishment would be delivered for her weakness, for her inability to perform adequately. The guard reached her and took hold of the bucket handle. For a frozen second, the nurse was certain he was going to dump the water over her head, or strike her with the heavy container, or do something else that would fulfill all the warnings she had internalized. But instead, he simply lifted the bucket from her hands, his face showing a frown that seemed to be directed at the situation rather than at her personally, and replaced it with a smaller bucket that had been sitting nearby, about half the size and therefore much more manageable. The guard gestured toward this smaller bucket, spoke a few words in English that were presumably instructions to use this one instead, and then walked away to continue his supervision of other areas. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 10 seconds. No punishment had been delivered. No cruelty had been inflicted. He had simply recognized an impractical situation and corrected it in the most straightforward way possible, providing a tool better suited to the task and the person performing it. The nurse stood frozen, staring at the smaller bucket, her mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The action made no sense in the context of everything she believed about these people. Enemies did not make your work easier. Captors did not show consideration for your physical limitations. The Americans were supposed to be brutes who would drive them until they collapsed, who would laugh at weakness and exploit it for entertainment. They were not supposed to notice difficulty and respond by making accommodations. In the kitchen, a similar moment of confusion occurred when prisoners stirring pots and preparing food had their stomachs audibly growling, their hunger impossible to suppress in the presence of so much food. When an American guard who was supervising the kitchen sampled a stew that was being prepared, tasting it presumably to ensure it met whatever standards were required, he then handed the spoon to one of the prisoners, a woman who had been standing nearby watching, and through gesture seemed to be asking her to taste it as well. The woman hesitated, frozen with uncertainty. Was this a test? Was the food poisoned and he wanted to see what effect it would have on a prisoner before allowing it to be served widely? Was he trying to trick her into doing something that would justify punishment? Her hand trembled as she took the spoon, her mind racing through possible consequences of whatever choice she made. Finally, driven by hunger that overrode caution, she lifted the spoon to her lips and tasted the warm broth. The flavour that hit her tongue was rich and genuine, beef and vegetables and seasoning, the kind of honest food she had not encountered in months. It was warm and nourishing and real, with no trace of bitterness or anything that might indicate contamination. Her eyes widened with surprise, and then to her horror, they began to fill with tears, her emotions overwhelming her defences in that moment when the simple goodness of warm food broke through her carefully maintained self-control. The guard, seeing her reaction, seemed satisfied that the stew was properly prepared and moved on to other tasks, apparently oblivious to the small crisis of understanding he had just triggered in the woman he had asked to taste the food. She stood there, spoon still in hand, tears running down her cheeks despite her best efforts to stop them, trying to reconcile the reality of what had just happened with everything she believed about who these people were supposed to be. In the laundry, steam rose around the prisoners as they bent over tubs, scrubbing at stained fabric, their hands quickly growing red and raw from the combination of hot water and harsh soap. The work was hard and the conditions were not pleasant, but it was familiar. Women had been doing laundry since time immemorial, and there was something almost comforting in the rhythm of the work once they settled into it, dip and scrub and rinse and wring, over and over, watching dirty water run clear, seeing stains gradually fade under persistent effort. The smell of the soap was harsh and chemical, stinging noses and making eyes water, but at least it was clean, a smell associated with hygiene rather than decay or neglect. For women who had spent weeks travelling in trucks with limited opportunities to wash themselves or their clothing, the very concept of cleanliness had taken on an almost sacred quality, something to be desired beyond what should have been its proper importance. Hours passed in this way, morning moving toward midday, the sun climbing higher in the sky and burning away the mist that had covered the ground at dawn. The work continued steadily, guards supervising but not driving the prisoners to unreasonable speed or impossible standards. They simply expected work to be done competently and at a reasonable pace, correcting with gestures and occasional words when something was not being done correctly, but not punishing errors with violence or humiliation. By midday, when the prisoners were finally given permission to stop and directed back toward the barracks, they were tired but not broken. Their muscles ached from unaccustomed labour, yes, and their hands were sore from gripping tools or handling wet fabric or stirring heavy pots, but they had not been beaten or starved or tortured. They had simply worked, performing tasks that, while certainly not pleasant, were within the range of what they could physically manage. The confusion this generated was more profound than the women could easily articulate even to themselves. Fear had not vanished. They still watched the guards with wariness, still jumped at sudden movements, still expected that at any moment the treatment might change and the promised cruelty might finally arrive. But doubt had been planted, growing alongside the fear, creating a cognitive dissonance that was almost painful in its intensity. Walking back to the barracks, several women spoke in low voices about what they had experienced. The work had not been punishment, they admitted to each other. It had simply been work. The guards had not been cruel. They had been indifferent at worst, and occasionally almost helpful. The food in the kitchen had been real and abundant. The laundry facility had been adequately equipped. The maintenance tasks had been routine rather than punitive. If this was enemy brutality, then what did actual civilized treatment look like? If this was the fate worse than death they had been warned about, then either the warnings had been wildly exaggerated or, and this was the truly frightening possibility, the warnings had been complete fabrications. But if the warnings were lies, then who had lied to them and why? These questions had no easy answers, and perhaps no answers at all, but they could no longer be avoided or suppressed. Back inside the barracks, the women collapsed onto their bunks with the kind of exhaustion that comes from physical labour combined with emotional strain. Their bodies were tired, but their minds were racing, trying to process what they had experienced, trying to fit it into a world view that had been carefully constructed over years of propaganda and war. The fit was becoming increasingly poor, the contradictions increasingly obvious. And when afternoon gave way to evening and food was again brought to the barracks, this time no one suggested it might be poisoned. The suspicion lingered, certainly, visible in the way some women still hesitated before eating, but hunger and the memory of that morning's relatively generous breakfast overcame caution. They ate, slowly at first and then with increasing enthusiasm, the bread and soup and coffee disappearing rapidly, as women who had been denying themselves out of fear finally accepted that refusal meant only that they would remain hungry while the food sat going to waste. The first wall of certainty was cracking, individual stones of belief becoming loose and unstable, and once that process started, it would prove impossible to stop. The women were prisoners, yes, but prisoners who had just completed their first full day in American custody without experiencing any of the horrors they had been promised would come. That reality was beginning, slowly but inexorably, to reshape their understanding of everything.